Tales from the Break Room is a scary story podcast made up of viewer-submitted stories. If you want your scariest work experiences featured on Tales from the Break Room, send your story to us at darkstories.org if you don't want to be paid for it. Otherwise, send your story to us at eeriecast.com/submit, only if you have a working PayPal account.
Hi, welcome to Dead and Roasted. What can I get you?
Hey there, welcome back to the Break Room. I've been obsessed with our new fish-flavored croissants lately, but I swear I found a scale on my nose the other day. So I think maybe avoid that menu item unless you want to end up a mermaid. Ah yes, of course, I do have some new scary and allegedly true work-related stories for you. These stories feature some very scary folks invading people's workplaces, as well as a very haunted shift where the dead simply don't stay dead. Enjoy these tales from the Break Room. Protection with a Pizza Pan. From Shiny. I have an art degree, and having such comes with great difficulty of finding jobs that relate to it. I moved from my small town to a bigger city that has a theme park. I felt like that was close enough to my love of art and entertainment. I worked as the painter, but I was also learning and working with the creative department. I met a lot of cool people and loved my new coworkers. Despite the lack of management, communication, and some creepy employees from different departments, I enjoyed my time there. The park was really a concert hall, theme park, water park, and zoo all in one. It was so big that there could be 100 people working that day, but depending on where you were, you could be all alone. I was the only painter, and I was used to putting on my headphones and going off to a different part of the park each day and starting my painting. On that day in particular, I was working in the water park, and I was already having a rough day dealing with finances when I got a call from my coworker. "Hey, what's up?" I asked, hoping to hear him say something stupid to help cheer me up and make me laugh. But I was wrong. "You need to find somewhere to hide." At those words, my heart dropped. I dropped everything I was doing and ran to the nearest building. When something like that happens, you stop thinking, and your instincts kick in. Not all my actions in that moment made sense, but all I knew was that my body just moved. "What's going on?" I asked as I ran. "Some guy is running from the cops. He's in the park. He's heading to the water park now." It felt as if my heart had stopped. I was a woman, alone in the water park area. I locked myself in a restaurant nearby with windowed doors. "I'm locking the doors. My hands won't stop shaking." It's okay, you'll be fine. Just breathe." All right, it's locked," I answered, finally hearing the lock click. "Is he armed?" I asked. "We don't know." I fell silent. The unknown is truly a terrifying thing. "Be safe. We'll keep you updated." He hung up. I was all alone then, with no radio and my phone at 15%. Eventually, my mind caught up and it hit me. A kitchen has knives. I looked around all over, but to my defeat, I found nothing. I'd left my hammer and my paint bucket too. But I did have my pocket knife, even if it could only do so much. Then I found a pizza pan. You know, the ones that are used to take the pizza in and out of the oven. I sighed, accepting the fact that if something happened, I would have to fight. I sat in the corner of the back room letting my husband know what was going on and that my phone was on low battery. I sat there in silence for what felt like ages. I slowed my breathing and prepared myself for the worst. After a long time of silence and my mind going through scenarios, I heard a noise at the door. My mind once again stopped as I heard the door open. I was numb as I stood with the sharp edge of the pan ready to slice at anything. I heard a voice, but I didn't process it. I was ready, footsteps getting closer and closer. Finally, a person came into view and I raised my weapon to strike. The police officer looked at me, and I just lost it. My built-up anxiety finally overflowed, and I let it all out as I was led away from the building. They had dogs out looking for the intruder. I was taken to one of the outside picnic tables, where another officer told me that I need to announce myself and answer them if that happens again, or else they could have sent the dog out after me. I understood where they were coming from, but in that moment of fear, fight took over, and all my other senses shut down. After a few more minutes of waiting, they finally found him. He had been hiding in the building right next to mine. He was armed, too, an escaped convict. Even though the worst thing that could have happened didn't happen, I dealt with temporary PTSD. I wouldn't go back to the water park for another week or two. I also didn't like being in big places, like Walmart. I was constantly paranoid as I marked out exits and potential weapons I could use. I constantly thought about what ifs. Thankfully, with therapy, I worked through it. I quit that job months later due to a mix of issues. I do miss my coworkers and some of the animals, but it's still always in the back of my mind. What can I use to fight? You get used to it. From Mike V. I worked as a security guard at one of the local hospitals, and despite what I'm going to tell you, it's a pretty good place to work. Hours are plentiful, pay is good, and the nurses are downright sweet. That being said, it is still a hospital, and as such comes with its own bad things. I confess, and forgive me if I come across as a little morbid, I've been in the presence of more death in the first 6 months on the job than the previous 30 years of my life. But that's not what this is about. This story is about the hospital basement. Now, I had initially been hired to work a specific area of the hospital. I had daytime hours, but when a full-time evening shift opened up, I went for it. Gotta make that extra money, which meant I had free range to patrol the whole property. One of the areas I had to patrol was the basement, which, contrary to what you might think, is a pretty busy part of the building. X-ray department, custodian, engineering, food prep, those are just some of the many departments that fill this basement, so it's not exactly a spooky, dark place like you might imagine. However, once 8 p.m. hits and the vast majority of employees have gone home, that basement gets very quiet, and that's when the incidents began. It was my first week as patrol officer, and so far had been rather uneventful, which I was fine with as a 5-year veteran of private security in other areas. I was kind of hoping for less action for a while. One night I was making my rounds in the basement when I began to hear footsteps. Normally this is no big deal, but it was late, so it caught my attention right away. Now I figured it was maybe a nurse who had to grab something or a visitor who took a hilariously big wrong turn, so I wandered over in that direction. As I approached the corner, I checked the wall mirror. For those of you who don't know, hospitals have ball-shaped mirrors to allow staff to check around corners, thus preventing any gurney fender benders. But I saw nothing. No people, no shadows, no movement of any kind. I rounded the corner to make sure, and it was an empty hallway. Only place they could have turned into were the elevators, and I would have heard the ding from them if someone had entered. It was strange, but I shrugged it off. Probably my brain messing with me. A similar incident happened a few days later. While checking to make sure that engineering didn't leave their equipment in plain sight, again, I suddenly heard voices. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but it was for sure human voices. I went to check, out of curiosity more than anything else. But no matter where I walked, the voices always seemed distant. I didn't see anyone, and I must have walked the entire basement, but the voices always sounded distant. Then suddenly, it went quiet, just like that, as if they'd left the area. How very strange, but again, I chalked it up to nothing unusual. Maybe some custodian had left a radio or podcast on or something. In my mind, it was all so easily explained and no big deal. While that could be explained easily enough, this next one was unnerving because I can't explain it to this very day. It was another day, another basement patrol, and I was walking down a large stretch of hallway when, in front of me, I noticed a set of doors close. These are the fire doors that held open magnetically. They're automatically closed upon the fire alarm going off. which incidentally had happened earlier that day, a false alarm in case you're wondering. Clearly, these two had not been pushed open after the all clear, so I walked over towards them to do the job. Then, one of them opened up. Not swung open aggressively, but just casually opened, like someone was just passing through. This caused me to stop in my tracks in shock. These doors are pretty heavy, so nobody could have just yanked it open and ducked out of sight. This door was pushed to the wall in one smooth motion, not shoved or slightly opened. Unless there was a very specifically located hurricane in that spot, those doors were not hit by a sudden draft, not one strong enough to open a fire door all the way. Needless to say, I decided to patrol the more populated areas that night. There was also the cold spots. So many cold spots in that basement. This wasn't wind or air conditioning, these were specific moments of cold that randomly disappeared shortly afterwards. These weren't normal, they were everywhere. Not just the same spots every time. Different spots. Spots where it should have been warm, such as by the food prep kitchen or near the CT scan room. It really made no sense. A few weeks of all these things and I was just doing my best to ignore it. The job paid well, and I didn't want to abandon ship just like that. But that nearly changed one evening. Another basement patrol. Woohoo, sadly I can't skip it or say I did when I didn't because the higher-ups, they would have known. So I was back again late at night in the creepy empty basement, telling myself that my car will be paid off a lot faster with this salary. I was approaching the corner from the first incident and checked the wall mirror on instinct. And I froze. A figure stood just around the corner. Not a person, but a human-shaped black mass. It was just standing there around the corner. I was horrified at that point. My mind already on high alert, now it was on red alert. I tried to reason with myself. It's just a smudge on the mirror. No, it couldn't be that. They clean those daily. I was horrified, shaken up. I was wishing I had a fellow guard with me. But what good would that really do, honestly? I was praying to God, Odin, Ra, freaking Santa Claus if I had to, that this thing didn't decide to move towards me. I stood there for what seemed like an eternity, when that thing finally walks the opposite direction of me. Defying all sense of reason, I decided to poke my head around the corner to try to get a look at this thing. But by then, it was gone. Disappeared. I looked up at the mirror, and it was clear as well. Just me in this basement. I scrambled up the stairs at a sprint and spent the remainder of the shift around the nurse's station expecting very little sleep that night when I got home. A couple of months later, and short of the aforementioned cold spots, things had calmed down. I was working an earlier shift one day, down in the basement with a coworker doing the rounds, when I heard the sound of voices. Now, admittedly, at that time of day, it could have been anyone, but I was still quite paranoid about this basement, so my mind instantly went to the worst possible scenario. I stopped then to turn to my coworker, asking in a freaked-out sounding way if they could hear those voices. To my relief, they said yes. I calmed down a bit, then my coworker replied, "You get used to it." And I instantly stopped and stared at them. "What do you mean?" I asked. "Voices, weird noises and all that crap. Work here long enough and you get used to it, especially in this area. I assumed you saw or heard something, judging by how you looked like a deer in headlights just now." I told them about my experiences, and they said, "Yeah, most of us all have had similar incidents when patrolling this area. Don't worry about it. You'll learn to shrug it off." I feel I should add quickly that this coworker is older and has been with the company for about 15 years, which to me explained how they were so casual and nonchalant about it while I was losing my crap. "Why this area?" I asked. "Never anywhere else." "Do you really have to ask?" They laughed. Then it hit me, and I almost kicked myself for not figuring it out. The shadow figure, the footsteps, the voices, the door, even the majority of the cold spots, they all happened within a close proximity of the morgue. I'd been given a tour of the facility when I started, But seeing as I was assigned a specific post when I began, I kinda just forgot about the morgue and its location. "Why wasn't I told at the start?" I asked. "Because you wouldn't have believed us. Admit it," they responded. I admit they were right. Had they mentioned it on day one, I would have laughed it off as either messing with the new guy or just silly stories, so I can't blame them. I worked at that hospital for a year before being transferred to a different site. Still a hospital, but this one doesn't have an ER, ICU, or a morgue, so I feel better. The coworkers are great, job still pays well, and I genuinely like being here. But still, I double-check those mirrors when I approach any corner, and I still jump at any sound when I'm alone at night on the job. I hope against hope that eventually I'll get used to it. Jim, from Jeremy A.H. I worked as an IT technician at a small hospital in southwestern Pennsylvania. My shifts varied from week to week, but I found myself working the night shift more often than not due to staffing. At the time, our crew had a few openings, so only one technician worked the overnight shift. This didn't really matter that much as work slowed to a crawl after the bulk of nursing staff left at 8. I grew accustomed to the boring mediocrity of the work, preparing for the morning shift and rounding the dark halls of the hospital wings. Most nights, I would only see a few dimly lit computer screens sitting in front of even more dimly lit faces of personnel waiting for their shifts to end. Occasionally, I found myself running into the lone night security guard who patrolled the same areas. The requirements of the shift's round were simple enough. Check all the computers and ensure staff had no issues. But there was one task in particular that wasn't so simple. An end-of-night task given to ensure the equipment in the upstairs storage area was restocked. Each night shift technician would be required to go to the basement storage, located in the old side of the hospital. The old building stood in stark contrast to the new renovations, with rebuilt flooring and rooms in each of the updated hospital wings. The halls, already poorly lit due to the energy-saving standards and patient requests at night, seemed to grow longer and darker as the flooring changed from the new wood floors to the cold, hard tiles used in the past. They reminded me of mental institutions in movies, the white speckled pattern only stopping due to cracks and some broken pieces signifying some bygone era of medicine that brought intrusive thoughts of lobotomies and botched procedures. The smell also changed drastically. The clean halls with barely a speck of dust on the handrails shifted to a musky smell that can only be defined as old. After fully engulfing yourself in the old building, it seemed a completely different atmosphere. The cleanliness and brightly painted corridors gave way to gray, washed-out monotone that pulled the surrounding color out like an evil sponge. Now, the walk to the old hospital was the easy part, as the only way to the storage area was a single elevator that seemed to be the progenitor of all elevators. Like this was the test build, and all other elevators existed only due to this one's sacrifice. Its doors only open slowly after the worn popped-out button is pressed. It only has access to a few floors: the basement storage, the boiler rooms, and where I stood, the laundry room. That night, I pressed the button. Its familiar click followed by a shuddering and grind that made me think the elevator finally died, and I had witnessed its death throes. The doors creak open and reveal a broken floor, cracked and repaired more times than seemed possible, and a new smell, one of old oil and thinning elevator cables. I stepped in, and my weight noticeably shifted the elevator down, causing it to not sit even with the floor. This has happened to me hundreds of times, but each is still as jarring as the last. I pressed the basement button, waiting for the doors to close. The ride was to be expected, bumpy and terrifying, each tug on the antiquated cables seemingly their last, as I slowly descended into the old basement. A burning kind of smell, like that of an engine with no oil, filled the air. According to the maintenance crew, this was normal. I held my breath, taking comfort in only falling a single floor from the boiler room if it happened. The doors shuttered, slowly opened, revealing a large room filled with all manner and sizes of boxes. A metal receiving door sat unused, taking up most of the left wall. My steps felt somehow more difficult on the concrete floor, as if something was weighing me down as I walked past the storage room door. I made my way over, ignoring the surroundings, lost in my list of required items. I fumbled for my keycard, which hung around my neck with my name and picture that updates the computer system when I access a door. My keycard was the size of an average credit card, sometimes unwieldy around my neck, but at least it was impossible to lose. I swiped and waited for the green light and the beep that accompanied the door unlocking. I pulled at the metal handle, a little more forceful than most doors as it always seemed wedged closed. The heavy metal door gave way to a much larger room filled with shelves that kept our equipment organized. I began to verify the items on the list, loading up a cart so the morning crew would have their necessary items for the day. Each printer, every keyboard, and small component placed on the large cart echoed in the room. I had just moved a particularly heavy item, a large printer, on the bottom of the cart, when a noise sounded, one that I didn't expect. The beep of the door being unlocked, accompanied by the click the lock makes when it's released. I stared at the door, letting my imagination get the better of me. There should be no one with access to that room in the hospital, and I'd seen way too many horror movies to not immediately think about another exit, but the storage area only had one. I lowered myself behind the cart, focusing on the door, watching and patiently waiting. Nothing. The lock slid back into place and the door's lights went red. I thought to myself it could be a glitch or some malfunction, and I made a note to message the security guys in the morning to check. They can easily see who accessed a door from the keycard they have. It logs the name and employee number of the person who swiped. I finished loading the materials needed, then headed toward the door at the other end of the room. I opened the heavy metal door and closed it behind me, ensuring it was locked. My first step toward the elevator was interrupted by a sound coming from deeper in the basement. We had no need to go that far in, as all that was back that way were old ramps and walkways that led nowhere now due to renovations. They were locked and could be used as an exit in case of a fire. I stopped and listened intently, trying to stifle my breathing long enough to hear. I heard a faint tapping, like a knock of someone who really isn't that interested in getting the attention of anyone in particular. This accompanied by the distant sound of footsteps. In any other part of the building, I normally wouldn't think anything of it, but no one came down here, ever. Even the maintenance workers had no reason, as all the pipes were moved to facilitate the new building. I considered calling out, but those scary movies crept up in the back of my mind, and I decided to head upstairs to check with the security team. The cameras would be able to see better than I could in any case. I walked quickly to the elevator, almost sprinting at the final few steps, and I waited for the doors to open. The terrifying mode of transportation seemed almost comforting as I jumped into its dilapidated confines. I knew pressing the button over and over would not make the doors close any faster or the elevator spring to life more quickly, but it didn't stop my shaking hand from repeatedly slamming the antiquated letter. The doors finally closed, but not before I noticed a figure hunched over, staring at me from the shadows. The gargoyle-like posture lent something otherworldly to their presence. I watched the room shrink to nothing, searing the sight of that thing in the darkness into my memory as the elevator moved away from that floor. I waited, breathing heavily, at the wooden panel doors. I kept pressing L to try and will the lift to get to laundry even a moment faster. My phone didn't work in the elevator, and even if I were outside, I had terrible reception in the old building. I moved slowly up, seeing the light leave the B2 button and bounce to B1, the old boiler room. An unexpected jolt stopped the elevator with the B1 button blinking slowly. I had not pressed B1. I was sure of it. It was impossible as I was so focused on the panel there would be no way I could have made that mistake. Much to my dismay, however, those doors slid open with a loud metallic grind. The boiler room floor was still part of the basement and could be reached via the corridors, so I felt every inch of the slow crawl the doors made to their open position. Then I stared into the darkness of the old boiler room, slamming the paint off the laundry room button. I watched every silhouette in that room, the only light source pushing back against the darkness being the elevator I was in. My imagination ran wild, filling my thoughts with serial killers and dark beings only found on the pages of novels and in film. The doors never seemed to close so slowly before, grating the rusted metal and causing my anxiety to grow with every inch. The doors began to close, but somehow the darkness itself began to seep in. It overtook my small light, first at each side, then invading the ceiling. I could only watch in horror as the shadows seemed to come for me. Finally, the doors closed. My savior, an elevator built while my grandfather was still in diapers. I sighed and took a few steps back as the light bounced from B1 to L, signifying that my journey into the abyss was nearly over. Eventually, the doors opened to the well-lit laundry room full of machines working dutifully on bedsheets and articles of clothing. Though it was something I saw almost every day, I was swept over with relief. Quickly, I walked out of the elevator and turned toward the new building. As I walked, I thought perhaps what I saw had been a trick of my mind, a simple shadow brought to life by too many movies and novels. After dropping the equipment back into the department, I waited for my shift to end, checking for issues and ensuring everything was set up for the next day. A few minutes prior to my shift ending, an alert was sent over the intercom. Code open, bellowed across my department. I'd never heard that code before, so I checked the employee guide on our nearest computer. I skimmed the listing down the page until I got to the code open. It read, "Overly aggressive or violent patient. Contact the security team immediately." I spun my chair toward the phone and picked up the receiver. I knew the night security guard pretty well, as we'd pass in the hallways sometimes, making small talk every now and then. I dialed the number and waited for the click at the other end. When he answered, it wasn't his normal spiel, saying his name and department, but an almost panicked, "Hello?" I asked if he knew what was going on and why the alert had been called. He told me a patient had escaped unnoticed from the emergency room a few hours earlier. A special guard had been called in and assigned to him, but he had attacked the guard, severely injuring him and taking all his gear. They called in the police because now he had a taser, pepper spray, and various other items. My thoughts shifted to who it might be. I knew the day shift guys. And as if he was reading my mind, he said it was Jim, as he was the only one who answered his phone that night. Jim was a tough guy, ex-army, but getting up in age. Maybe that's why he had difficulty handling that patient. Apparently, poor Jim had been injured and knocked out, forced into the bed, and strapped down with a blanket over him. He was there for hours. If the nurse in the morning didn't notice a missing guard in the corner of the room, it may have been quite some time until they actually found him. He explained the missing man was an animal, but came in semi-sedated. He had self-medicated to the point of delirium, and the police were supposed to pick him up, but were called away due to some pileup on a freeway. "Hey, no worries. He's probably long gone by now," the shaky voice said on the other end of the receiver, seemingly trying to reassure himself more than me. I was about to let him go when I remembered my note. "Hey, can you tell me who accessed the door on B2 a little bit ago? It clicked open, but no one came in." I folded the note and threw it in the garbage. His anxious voice cracked. "I need to go now." The panic rose in his voice as he spoke. "Says here, it was Jim." Some dementia patients can be terrifying. From Anon. When I was in my first few years of college, I had great interest in working with the elderly. I'd always connected with older generations more than my own. I appreciated the history they lived through and the stories they had to share about it, even if I got one that was a little too eccentric about certain historical events. Many of them had such valuable things to say, and mostly no one other than the family they had left to share it with. It was no surprise I ended up in an assisted living facility for a summer job. I enjoyed assisted livings because I could still see the patients live their lives while giving them the care they needed. Some were able to shower and toilet themselves alone, others weren't. And when they weren't, I was there to provide care and dignity to their struggles. The only things that were unfortunate about the job were the hours and the ratio of residents to employees. On any given shift, I would have a 10-to-1 resident to employee ratio, and I was working second shift. So with half my ratio being in wheelchairs and the other half being frail or needing memory care, I had my hands full 24/7. This of course makes it difficult to connect with residents, the main reason why I wanted this summer job. Nonetheless, I found time for my residents and ways to build relationships with them. But we all know that this story isn't going to be rainbows and butterflies. I'd been working there for a little over 3 months and was working so hard to build a relationship with a memory care resident. His dementia had made him a shell of the man he used to be, or at least that's what I was told by the family when they came to visit. He was extremely quiet and only seldom spoke words to employees that he seemed to take to. His name was Mr. Jones. Mr. Jones was under my care most of the time I was on duty. He had begun to warm up to me slowly but surely through the 3 months I'd been working there. He was able to toilet and shower himself, but he needed reminders due to his dementia. Across the hall from Mr. Jones lived a man by the name of Mr. Owens. Mr. Owens was also a memory care resident, but his dementia varied greatly from Mr. Jones's. He had something called Lewy body dementia, which combined with his PTSD from serving in Korea, made him quite the caseload. He was notorious for getting combative when he had episodes, and would often mistake us employees for other people. He had never struck me, but he had struck others. Me and Mr. Owens had only had several vocal altercations, all of which were centered around him going into other residents' rooms. That was an absolute no-no. Though our residents maintained their autonomy for the most part within our facility, we were still held accountable for their actions, especially if it involved them and another resident. I often caught Mr. Owens in others' rooms at night as he was sundowning. You might know what this is if you saw the awful horror movie from 2015 called The Visit. It sucked. However, sundowning is what can often happen to dementia patients when the sun goes down. It refers to erratic and aggressive behaviors toward the late afternoon and nighttime, and often also includes pacing and anxiety as well. Mr. Owens did this very often, and on his sundowning journeys he'd often wander into another patient's room and either wake them from their slumber in a panicked state because someone is in their freaking room, or he'd rummage through their belongings, which is also a major no-no for obvious reasons. On the particular night this story occurred, I was helping Mr. Jones get ready for bed. I was aiding him in remembering to change into his pajamas, brush his teeth, and take his nighttime medications. I sat with him for a moment after he crawled into his bed, and he looked at me with kind eyes. He said, "Thank you, my dear." I was so overcome with emotion, knowing that this gentle old soul trusted me enough to speak to me, and I replied, "You're always welcome, Mr. Jones. Have a good night, and I'll see you tomorrow afternoon," with a warm smile on my face. He told me he wasn't ready for bed just yet, and still had much to do tonight. With an okay, I took off to begin my cleanings for the night. This was around 8:30 to 9 o'clock. After sharing with my coworker the pride I took in knowing Mr. Jones trusted me, I completed all my cleanings with the wind of the healthcare gods under my wings. I felt as if I was truly excelling as a nurse aide. That was until bed check. I made my way down my wing of the building, gently knocking on doors as to not wake the residents. But if they were up and doing private business, if you understand what I'm saying, I wouldn't invade their privacy. I only had one resident still awake, and that was Mr. Owens. I had knocked and opened the door to check his room to hear him in the shower. I figured I would finish the rest of the hall and circled back to check on him after a little bit of time passed. The next resident to check was Mr. Jones. After knocking, I entered his room and saw his silhouette lay on its side facing away from me, barely lit up by the milky moonlight. I saw his shoulder rise and fall ever so softly. I smiled and turned to leave the room when I heard a drip, drip, drip from the bathroom. Odd, I remarked to myself. I don't remember that dripping sound from earlier, and I'm sure he'd turned the faucet off after brushing his teeth. I pulled out my phone and planned to use its flashlight to illuminate the bathroom instead of turning the light on and possibly waking Mr. Jones. Upon turning on the flashlight and lighting up the small room, I saw crimson. There was blood everywhere, It coated the tile in thick pools. Chunks of sinew and skin were mixed into the blood on the tile. I recoiled in horror. What the hell happened here? I moved my phone up as I pulled my hands to my face in terror, and in doing so, I illuminated the sink and medicine cabinet. Hanging from the medicine cabinet were strips of skin, red with blood and torn as though they weren't removed neatly. I panicked. I radioed my coworker on the walkie-talkie to call the police and an ambulance, and I made my way to Mr. Jones's bedside. He'd been skinned. Strips of his chest, legs, arms, and face were gone. They'd been removed from him like a freaking animal that had been hunted. I stayed with him until emergency services arrived. I watched him be wheeled off, then turned and began to micromanage my wing of residents, as they were all in a panic now upon hearing the ambulance come. I went room to room to check on them, ensuring their safety and that whoever did this to Mr. Jones didn't harm anyone else. Upon getting to Mr. Owen's room, I knocked and entered. I could see the light coming from under his bathroom door. I knocked and asserted myself, saying I was coming in to check his safety, but I wish I had never opened that door. Mr. Owens was squeaky clean, standing in front of the mirror, humming an old tune and shaving his face. But the bathroom, oh God, the bathroom. It was covered in towels and red blood. It looked like a triage room in the ER after a gunshot victim had entered. I looked around, taking it all in. Life felt like slow motion. When we locked eyes, he winked at me. I was at a total loss for words. I babbled and stuttered, trying to get away from the man as fast as I could. I ran to the hallway and locked the man in his room. I heard him behind me as I ran out. He wasn't running. He was just slowly walking to the door separating us. I saw him try the doorknob. It's like he knew I was watching. After he tried it a few times to no avail, I heard him say,
"What? Nothing to say? That's okay. The quiet ones make better victims anyhow."
Needless to say, I quit that job, and I stayed as far away from dementia residents as possible. Mr. Jones died from his injuries. And Mr. Owens? That worthless prick is doing life in a facility, locked far, far away from the quiet ones he so desired. An Active Morning from Aimee. This story takes place in a grocery store, which we already knew was haunted. To be fair, the entire island we were on was known to be haunted, so small paranormal things happened every so often. At the time, I worked at a small mom-and-pop grocery store as a cashier. It was the only one on that end of the island. You could see most of the store from the register and down specific aisles depending on which register you were at. There were 4 aisles that had another aisle which cut through them halfway down. Working here, everyone had long since gotten used to tugs on our clothes, things usually falling off the shelves on aisle 1, which is where the least amount of breakable things were, among other things. There was that morning where a glass jar of hot chocolate mix fell from a top shelf and shattered without a noise, and that did have us scratching our heads. We'd long since believed that the ghost in the store was the previous owner who was the father of the current owner. He was referred to as Red, and usually blamed for most of the incidents. I happened to be the opening manager one morning when the activity ramped up for no reason that I was aware of. I arrived about half an hour before opening, and I knew I would be alone since my coworker B never showed up until her exact clock-in time, which would be 7 in the morning. So I opened up the door, locked it behind me, and I turned off the alarm. The store always had a few lights left on just so we weren't completely in the dark, and we usually kept it on that partial lighting until 5 minutes to open. I started going about my morning tasks, first thing being to grab the newspapers and count them. I headed over to the second entrance to the store, opening that door to grab everything. I put the newspapers on top of the carts, and as I started counting them, I noticed I could hear footsteps. Directly in front of me was a lattice that acted like a wall to separate where the carts were from the rest of the store. Our soda machine was on a counter directly on the other side, and it was the beginning of aisle 1 as well. I could very distinctly hear footsteps on the aisle, even though I was the only person in the store. I popped my head around the corner, just to be sure, and there was nothing there. I shrugged, assuming it was just the usual ghostly antics, and I kept counting newspapers. The footsteps kept coming back, though, following me up to the registers where I had to confirm the lotto ticket numbers. They kept walking in front of the registers, and even the plastic bags began to rustle. This made me a bit more nervous, since I had to have my back to the rest of the store while I did these numbers. As I finished up, I decided to turn the lights on early, hoping that might quiet things down a little. I had to walk past all the aisles to reach the back room where the light box was. Aisles 1 and 2 were normal, but I jumped as I passed aisle 3, because standing halfway down at the cross aisle was a tall black humanoid mass. It stood probably about 6 feet tall. I picked up my pace, wanting to just return to the front of the store, but knowing I had to turn the lights on still. I had to go down aisle 4 and past the cross aisle where I'd just seen the entity. I'm a little embarrassed to admit that I ran past that part and I ducked behind the freezers where the light box was, and I turned everything on. Then I had to go past that section again. This time I did look, but I saw nothing there. I made a detour to grab the tills for the registers, and as I was putting them in the tills, the footsteps and bag rustling started up again. As soon as I was done with that, I pretty much refused to do anything else, and I just stood with my back against the counter, listening to the footsteps throughout the store. There was one last scare in the store for me, though. Earlier than expected, there was a loud knocking on the window behind me, which nearly made me jump out of my skin. I'd never been so relieved to see my coworker before. As soon as she came in, everything else quieted down. But I did tell the rest of my coworkers about it. It's the only time any of us had ever seen an apparition in the store. Afterwards, I never had a morning like that again. It just went back to the usual clothes tugging and cups falling off of shelves on aisle 1. But I can tell you one thing, I'll never forget seeing that shadowy mass on aisle 3. Level B2 from K. Just as some background, I worked in digital marketing, but the COVID pandemic hit pretty hard in my country. I got laid off due to my old company being shut down. So for a year now, I took the trade of my father and became a full-time plumber. The job is fine. I get to work on my own time and the bills are paid. There has not been that many downsides, well, not until this particular day that I'm about to share with you. I got a call from a small company on the edge of town. They needed a toilet to be unclogged, and they needed it fixed fast. I wasn't doing anything that day, so I got my tools and drove out there. It was at an old building surrounded by fancy new ones. I'd been there before, but that was years ago. I could have sworn they had demolished this building to make way for a new modern office block, but I guess they hadn't yet. The plumbing might not be in the best shape, I thought to myself. I drove into the parking lot. It was an opening that led to an opening that goes down maybe a floor or two into the basement of the building. As I entered the lot, there was a boy there. He couldn't have been older than half my age. He took a look at my car and told me to pay a small fee for the parking. I asked him, "Where's the parking barrier?" He told me it was being maintained, so he'll be collecting the parking fee. "Sure," I said. I didn't want to argue as I was almost late for the job, so I reluctantly paid the boy, and he then handed me what looked to be a used parking card, usually to indicate someone had paid for the parking fee. To be honest, it was sketchy at best, but these are the things you have to deal with in this part of town. He then told me to immediately take a left from here and find parking at the back, as he pointed straight down a long line of cars. Again, I'd been there before, and the building I'm supposed to be at, Block C, is just behind him on the right. So I had to ignore his instructions. I took a sharp turn and sped through the parking lot towards C Block. I heard him yelling, trying to stop me. It didn't take me long to find a parking spot. I was lucky enough to find one really close to the elevator. There were people coming in and out of the building, understandably so, as it was nearing the end of a working day. I took out my 2 toolboxes and headed to the elevator. As I pushed the button to go up to the 4th floor, I quickly noted my surroundings, and I double-checked my location to be sure. It was C block, parking spot number 186, floor B2. The parking lot had yellow pillars. All right, got it, I thought. That's easy to remember. Long story short, I came and I did my job. Turns out it was just clumps of toilet paper stuck inside the pipes. I cleared the blockage, and the guy actually gave me a pretty big tip. We had a small chat, and I hurried back to the toilet to pack my things as I didn't want to get stuck in traffic. My house was at the other side of town, after all. As I was packing up my tools, I looked at my watch. It was 7 p.m. I thought to myself, yeah, great, just in time for dinner. I carried my toolboxes with both hands and headed back to level B2. When I got there were still plenty of parked cars, but mine wasn't there. I looked around, thinking another car may have blocked it from my view, or it was at the other side of the elevator exit. But it wasn't. I scoured the area looking for it several times. I sighed and wondered if I went off on the wrong floor, so I went to the floor above me, B1. To my surprise, that floor was even worse. It definitely was not where I'd parked my car. It didn't even look like the same building. Then I remembered the parking spot number, 186. I came back down and tried to relocate my car that way. As the elevator opened, I could already see the numbers on the floor, indicating the parking spot numbers. The last spot, right at the edge, was number 180. So I checked the spot next to it, 179, 178, 177. The number just kept getting smaller and smaller, so it couldn't be along that row, right? I felt really tired, and I didn't feel like walking to find out, so I went back up to the 4th floor to try and retrace my steps. I went back to the office and walked back to the elevator with my toolboxes still in my hands. Everything was the same as when I arrived, only now the sun was slowly making its way down for nightfall. There seemed to be fewer and fewer people as time passed. Again at the elevator I pressed B2, and this time, the parking lot looked like level B1 from previously. The pillars were gray and there seemed to be fewer cars. I walked around the area to find my car, desperately trying to activate the alarm from my remote, but nothing happened. My car's alarm didn't go off. This was unusual because usually if the alarm was triggered, I could hear it blaring from pretty far away. I looked at my watch again. It was 7:15 p.m. I thought I was going crazy because it couldn't have been that short of a time that passed. At this point, cars were driving past me left and right as office hours ended a while ago. Pretty soon the parking lot was empty, save for a few dusty cars that looked like they had been abandoned. Thinking I must have entered the wrong block, I walked all the way to the end of the parking lot, only to find a dead end. Just a wall of concrete. At this point, I'd given up looking for my car, and I figured I would just find the exit and come back for my car tomorrow. The exit signs were everywhere, but the more I followed the signs, the more confused I got. I kept going in circles, and I always ended up back at the elevator. So I came back to the ground floor, and there was a small desk with a security guard on his phone. I asked him, "Is this C block?" He said, "Yep, this is C block." Then I asked, "Is there any elevator I can use to get to level B2? He replied, "No, there is only this elevator for this block." He seemed disinterested to assist me, but that's probably the only information I needed. So I went down the same elevator again, this time first to level B1 just to make sure I'm not on the wrong floor. When the doors opened, I peeked out, and no, my car wasn't there, so I continued to B2. Now B2 was completely empty. There was nothing. Nobody in work clothes, no cars going out, just still air in a basement. Again? I asked myself. So yes, again, I walked around trying to find my car. I saw a sign that pointed me to block D, and I decided to follow it, thinking maybe I parked it at the wrong block. I treaded carefully and set a few visual markers so I could retrace my steps. After maybe about 20 minutes, a few turns, and a few times catching my breath, I felt like I got to a part of the car park that hadn't seen a visitor in months. It was dusty, it was dark. I looked around and there I saw on the walls, C. I was still in C block. I checked my wristwatch, 7:20 p.m. I was about to lose my mind right there and right then. I dropped my toolboxes and ran to the elevator and got on the ground floor. I took a cab home and I slept in the cab. That was my day. The following day, I went back to the building. I went through the same reception counter, same elevator, the door opened, and there it was in plain sight. My car, just in front of the glass pane that you see as you exit the car park. The most unusual part? The toolboxes I left were right next to the car, on the driver's side door. I got in and I pulled out, vowing to never again step foot in this building. It's been a few weeks since then. I never knew what happened that day, nor do I ever want to find out. Invisible Employee from Vladimir. I'll start by saying I'm a skeptic. My mind runs through any logical explanation when something supernatural happens. I don't immediately believe stories or videos, even if I'm creeped out by them, and think, heck no. However, once my mind runs through everything and comes up empty, I'll admit, well, that's something for sure. I just don't know what. In 1907 through 1908, the property I work at opened as the first tuberculosis hospital in Kentucky. In 1940, when its more well-known sister hospital couldn't hold any more patients, the building I now work in was built to take them in. When the sister hospital finally closed, my work took the remaining patients. At some point, we became an institute for the mentally and physically disabled. When I began working as a housekeeper, I was on first shift. I heard many stories of ghosts, shadow figures, and strange creatures roaming outside and inside the building. The property has many structures once used to house nurses, doctors, and other staff during the tuberculosis outbreak, now used for other departments. These stories often came from the residents who died during the nursing home phase. However, I quickly learned the history of the institute, and many of the stories could be from either time period. To me, they were just that, stories to spook the new guy. Although deep down I wanted to experience one of those stories myself, since I also enjoyed ghost or supernatural stories, even if I barely believed in them. Eventually, I discovered that we once had a morgue within the building, which explains our one elevator that opens on both sides, leading to a back door. I was moved to third shift and forgot all about the stories I'd heard from first shift. Our cleaning carts have a distinct sound, so distinct that people would say, "Here comes housekeeping," half joking, half out of habit. I mention this because one night when I was alone, I heard a similar noise. I stopped stalking my cart and walked into the hall to see who from second was still there. But there was no one. 5 minutes went by, and I hear it again. I was thinking someone was playing a prank on me. I searched the housekeeping hall, but again I found no one. Either I'd gotten so used to my cart's unique voice or something else was making the noise. Finding no answer, I just went back to work. This sound went on for months without an explanation. Listening closely, though, I noticed it sounded like our carts, but not. There was a specific word that described what I was hearing, but I couldn't figure it out. It wasn't just me who heard it either. Anyone on third shift who needed to pass through our hallway heard it. We all just assumed it was the pipes. Everyone knows the old girl needed a makeover after all these years. With my luck, I ended up training a new employee mid to late 2017. I had her grab a chemical we had run out of as I started on a bathroom. When she still didn't come back after a while, I stepped out of the bathroom and looked down the hall, since housekeeping was just in view. She was just standing there, dazed. Bolting past the double doors, she returned to my side and managed to get out a quiet, "I don't know where it is." She clearly lied because I could see she never even entered the chemical room. I didn't call her out on it, and I went with her so she would know where it was in case our boss asked, and hopefully to calm her down. She didn't last long, and she moved to first shift, leaving me alone again. In early 2018, a storm took the power out, even the backup generator. I turned my phone's flashlight on and put my supplies up, heading over to the lobby since they had their own generator in times of emergency. I didn't want to be near a back door that was now not locked, plus I had to see if the lobby elevator was still working. As I took one step out of the cart room, I shined my light on the double doors and began to walk. I stopped dead in my tracks when I heard the doors open, but could clearly see they were still closed. That's when I heard our friendly pipes come rushing towards me. "A gurney," I blurted, when I finally realized what I'd been hearing for half a year. Feeling as if someone was waiting for me to move, I glanced at the office I'd stopped in front of. Housekeeping's office. That's when I remembered our office was once the morgue. I sidestepped and gave a simple, "My bad," and continued on my way feeling weird about what I'd said. After all, there was no one there. After this incident, I never heard the gurney again, and the others on third shift who had heard it were happy it was gone. They thought the pipes had been fixed. Maybe my brain played a trick on me since I wanted an experience and the situation was just right. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. 2 months after that experience, I was relieving second shift, and the new guy who I'd never spoken to pulled me aside before he left, and he asked me, "Is it normal to hear a gurney in our hallway?" A Horrifying Shift from Silver Bullet 54. Lots of people aren't fans of hospitals. For some, it's the bare white walls and endless corridors. For others, it's the constant smell of disinfectant, chlorine, and bleach. The worst is someone who last saw someone they cared about in a hospital before losing them. For me, ever since 2007, it's because you never know what's in there, especially at night. At one point in my life, I signed up as a residential assistant. I would see what a doctor did throughout the day and write it down. This also served the purpose of helping a friend of mine who wanted to become a nurse. As an RA, I also assisted with feeding, bathing, and cleaning in the hospital as an unpaid intern. It wasn't easy, it wasn't fun, but it made me appreciate all the work that hospitals do. At one point, an old man named Lewis started asking me to tell his minister to leave him alone. I asked, "What are you talking about?" He told me that every other day a man dressed in black would come and speak to him at around 9 p.m. That was far past visiting hours, and Lewis just wanted to sleep. However, he admitted that he knew the man would appear whenever a deep chill was felt in his room. He told me that the man had just visited yesterday, so the next night he would probably show up. The following day, the doctor I was shadowing had to attend a conference a few cities over and asked me not to do anything big. I would just help someone with simple tasks like cleaning or bathing and also not touch anything too expensive or dangerous. Before the doctor left, I decided not to mention the unwelcomed visitor. At 6 p.m., Lewis asked me to keep the man away from him. I sat down in a chair, read some magazines I'd brought, and just waited. The whole time I kept noticing Lewis looking fearfully at his doorway, even fidgeting a bit. At 9:15, I was about to tell him that maybe he wouldn't show up. That's when the room suddenly got cold. I looked over at Lewis. His face had gone pale. I looked at his doorway and got the shock of my life. A man was standing there as still as a statue. He had a book, a small black hat called a beretta. He was wearing a black shirt with a white collar, black pants, and black shoes. Even his book of prayers and hymns was black. I looked at Lewis and asked if he had any idea what was going on. He told me that the headwear meant he was a Catholic minister, and Lewis himself was Catholic. This minister walked over and looked down at Lewis. He didn't hold his hand, didn't comfort him, didn't offer a prayer. Instead, he just stood there. I eventually freaked out, and I told the man, "You're going to need to leave." The minister looked up and shook his head, then softly said, "Not yet," and vanished. 5 days later, Lewis died in his sleep. I asked the doctor about it, and he said, "It's very sad. Lewis was a good man, always kind, polite, and happy when we were around. He was a well-liked patient. His minister even paid him a special visit on his last night at about 9 p.m. Sure, visiting hours were over, but I can't reject a man of God." I never told the doctor about the minister who was there, but I've started thinking. He said not yet. He was always looking at just Lewis, and he was with him on his last night, apparently. So maybe he wasn't a minister, or even a ghost of a minister. What if he was the Grim Reaper himself? That was the last shift I served and quit the next day. The Resident Who Never Left. From Jalk, 1987. I'm a housekeeping manager in a small nursing home. Most of the time I do admin work, but if someone calls in, I work as a housekeeper in the home. On this occasion, one of the housekeepers was out with COVID, so I was working quite a bit as a housekeeper. One morning in August of 2021, I went about my normal routine. I went into this one resident's room. She was one of my favorite residents. Let's call her Miss H. Miss H was always upbeat and happy. She was also always moving about, so it was odd to see her in her room. I went into her room and did my daily cleaning. I greeted her with, "Hello, Miss H, how are you today?" She responded gruffly, "It's awful cold and dark in here." This was odd because it was a very warm day that day. She was also in her bed under a bunch of blankets. I finished up my cleaning and I asked her if she needed anything else. She then said, "I want the TV on." This was weird too because she normally never watched TV. But I did as she asked and I left the room. I began to go down the hall to the next room when I ran into one of the CNAs who asked why I was cleaning Miss H's room already. I answered that it was just my routine. She responded, "Miss H died early this morning. They already came to pick up her body." I was shocked. She was just in there. She had just been talking to me. I went back to her room to see. It was empty, but the TV was still on. Encounters at the Roadhouse. From Anonymous. Back in 2010 to 2011, I worked at a restaurant called the Roadhouse. It has since closed and reopened under a new name and a new owner. But this is a collection of encounters that myself and former coworkers experienced. Some history of the building first, though. The restaurant was partially set in a former farmhouse built in the early 1800s. During the Civil War, Confederate soldiers likely stayed in the house or on the property before or after the Battle of Gettysburg. In the 1980s, the mother of the owner, when I worked there, bought the place and ran it until her death. She lived in an apartment above the restaurant in the house portion of the place. Now on to some encounters. There was an original staircase in the center of the restaurant, which led to the upper floor, where the owner at the time lived after her mother passed. It also led to a private room, which was occasionally used for parties and the like, as well as the employee bathrooms and locker room. One day, a server was counting up her tips while sitting on these stairs, when she suddenly smelled rosewater perfume seconds before feeling fabric, as if from a large skirt brushing past her leg. An encounter I had upstairs was a little more unsettling. At the top of the stairs, you could go left to the owner's apartment, straight into the office, or left to the private room and the bathroom and locker room beyond. As I passed the private room, I glanced inside and suddenly got an uneasy feeling. Turning down the hallway, I saw this black shadow of a man in 3/4 profile, staring at me with glowing red eyes. But the feeling I got from this was not evil. It just felt very, very annoyed. I turned around and went back to work as best I could, but for the next 2 weeks, I refused to go back upstairs. A bartender there had 2 experiences while out at the bar. The bar had seating on all 4 sides and took up the center of the restaurant, with 3 dining rooms branching off of it. The bartender said that one late afternoon, she saw a man in a tall hat and long coat enter through the back entrance, walk around the far end of the bar, and enter the dining room beyond. She knew no one was back there, and no tables had been set due to a slow day, so she went to question the man, but when she entered, no one was there. The next encounter was corroborated by the owner. The same bartender was restocking and saw a man get up from the bar and walk through the wall behind where he had been sitting. The owner was reading the paper at the time, but saw the movement from the corner of her eye. Turns out the spot he went through had formerly been where the front door was located, before the restaurant was renovated by the owner's mother. Now, when I worked at this restaurant, I worked as a prep cook in the very back of the kitchen, next to the dishwasher. Most of the encounters were in this area. The first one that happened was actually innocent, though. I had some lemon drops in my pocket, and I repeatedly felt like someone was trying to reach into my pocket for these candies. The next one, however, was far from innocent, and scared me for a while, literally and metaphorically. One day, as I was talking to the one dishwasher we had, who we affectionately called Grandma due to her age and gentle, caring personality, I felt a burning sensation on my shin. Thinking it was a bee sting due to it being summer, I brushed my leg hoping to shoo the insect away. When the burning intensified, I looked down and I was shocked at what I saw. A red line was forming down my leg. The line was puffy and red and hurt like hell. Then my skin broke open and I started to bleed. Frightened, I looked over at Grandma, but she was just as shocked as I was. We told the owner, and she offered to let me go home for the day. She very much believed in the ghosts there. It was widely believed that her mother still visited the apartment and would pull small pranks moving objects. I declined her offer and got back to work after being bandaged up. Still, the owner bought me a drink at the end of my shift. The last and most memorable account also occurred in the prep area. On one of my tables, there was an old radio, like 1989 boombox old. The antenna was one of those large telescoping metal ones, and the volume control was a sliding stick. The radio only picked up like 3 stations, but the one that came in clearest was one of the local country stations. One day while working, George Strait came on the radio, but then soon after, another male voice joined in. Turning around, there was no one there. Exiting the prep area, I saw 2 line cooks up on the line, but they couldn't have gotten up there so fast without me hearing them. Around then is when Grandma came back to the dish station, and I told her about what happened. As I was talking, the volume on the radio turned up on its own. Intrigued, we asked if the volume could be turned down, to no one in particular. And then the volume went down on its own. We tested it again, asking if the volume could be turned up once more. And again it was. In disbelief, I made an offhand remark about the spirit enjoying George Strait, and the volume turned up even higher. And one last quick mention, the final entity I will tell you about was in the basement. I say entity because there was never a specific encounter. Rather, there was just this constant heavy feeling of being watched. Whatever was down there did not like being disturbed. The Haunted Gym. From Jax. I'm going to be sharing with you a classic ghost story that circled around my high school for a long time. I did not experience this story firsthand, but the person who did told me and my classmates himself. It's up to you to decide at the end of this story whether you believe him or not. However, his experience still brings me chills to this day. The story takes place at a small-town middle/high school in Michigan. I must have been in 6th or 7th grade when I heard it for the first time. There was a man who worked as a janitor, and as a substitute teacher there. He was loved by pretty much everyone. He was an older guy, but really sweet and always kind. For privacy reasons, I'll call him Mr. Gary. One day, Mr. Gary was substituting our social studies class. It was a free day too, so we had nothing else to do, except for talk. So we all begged Mr. Gary to tell us one of his stories, since we had heard him mention encountering ghosts before. Eventually, he gave in and began telling us his most horrifying experience yet, one that he admitted he could not explain to this day. It was dark outside, most likely around midnight or some later hour, when Mr. Gary was doing his janitorial duties around the building. Since the school had closed for the day, all the doors leading to the outside were locked up. Now, Mr. Gary was the only person in the building that night. He had been absolutely sure of it. He was almost done with his work. All he had left to do was to clean the middle school gym and the locker rooms inside it. However, as Mr. Gary started to approach the gym, he began hearing something very strange. Shouting, cheering, the sound of balls bouncing and sneakers squeaking. Mr. Gary could have sworn he was hearing what sounded like a basketball game. Thinking that he had forgotten there was a game that day, and that it was earlier in the night than it seemed, Mr. Gary walked over to the gym and opened the doors. It instantly grew quiet. The gym was empty and dimly lit by only a couple of lights, and there was no one there. Now, Mr. Gary did admit that he is a very skeptical and logical person when it comes to ghost experiences. So he said he brushed it off as him hearing things or something like that. After telling himself he was just hearing things, Mr. Gary continued into the gym and began cleaning up, picking up trash such as soda cans and throwing them away in one of those large circular trash cans that were all over the school. After he finished cleaning the actual gym, he entered the girls' locker room connected to the gym and cleaned up in there as well. When he came back out and into the gym, Mr. Gary saw something absolutely terrifying. For reference, in the center of the basketball court, there is a line in the shape of a circle with a Spartan head in the center of it, since that was our school mascot. What Mr. Gary saw was soda cans. They had been neatly and perfectly lined up along the line of the circle. But there was no one there still. No one else was in the building. No one could even get in either. Mr. Gary was alone, and he just could not logically explain how those soda cans he had thrown away before had now magically jumped out of the trash can and lined themselves up perfectly, inhumanly, along the line of the circle. It was impossible, unexplainable. It was supernatural. That's when Mr. Gary decided that the ghost basketball game he had heard earlier and the soda cans must be connected, and that there was something wrong going on here. Mr. Gary quickly finished his janitorial duties and went home. Sometime later, he called one of his friends up and explained what had happened. She laughed at him and thought he was joking and trying to scare her. When Mr. Gary asked why she thought he was lying, she explained that someone else from the area had shared a similar experience publicly, and it was even included in a portion of a Michigan ghost story book. Mr. Gary was in shock. He had no idea that this had been an experience that happened outside of himself, and he was extremely unsettled. And his friend still wouldn't believe him either. Like I said, Mr. Gary was a skeptical man of supernatural things, and whilst telling the story, he still tried to disprove his experience and write things off. He doesn't really believe in ghosts or the supernatural, and that's what makes me believe him even more, and what makes his story even more horrifying. The man had no reason to make it up whatsoever. He had no benefit or gain, and he wasn't even interested in supernatural things. He didn't believe in them. I never actually tried to find the Michigan ghost story book that the other person's encounter was recorded in, but you're welcome to try and find it yourselves. If you do, let me know. This story truly terrifies me, even now, 7.5 years later. I can't imagine the other things that school janitors might see once students and staff go home, when they're all alone in a dark and creepy building. Hotel Horrors from Shinigami0716. I'm a 36-year-old man working as a maintenance supervisor at a hotel here in Tennessee. I've always been one that has an open mind to things we do not understand. My job consists of going into rooms after customers check out, fixing any issues that may have been caused by rowdy check-ins, and just general maintenance and upkeep. Being that I work in a hotel, it goes without saying that there have been suicides, overdoses, and what have you here. One night as I was working over, things just seemed off. I got into the elevator from the lobby and pushed the button for the 4th floor. The doors closed, and I watched the numbers on the floor light hit 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and then it stopped. On the 3rd floor, the doors opened, and I was expecting someone to get on, perhaps going up or even heading out. But as the doors fully opened, there was nobody there. Shrugging it off, I hit the button for the 4th floor again. I made it to my floor okay this time and walked to the room I was currently working on. At one point, I was in the bathroom placing fixtures, and I heard the door open and close. I saw a reflection walk past the bathroom mirror. It's not unusual for my boss to come into the room to check on my progress or even perhaps change some things. So as a reaction, I called out his name. But I got no answer after a few seconds. I then stepped out and looked around the corner into the living area. It was completely empty. Nothing had been moved, and nobody was on the balcony either. Deciding I was just tired, I kept working for about another half hour and went home. The next day, I had to work over again. Same room, but I would be working on the plumbing this time. Again, after I was in that room a while, I heard the door open once more, and I heard someone walking towards the living area. Right away, I got up and went to check, just to see a completely empty room. Only this time, I heard the door open and slam shut. Being only a few steps away from the door, I got to it as fast as I could, snatched the door open, and looked both ways in the hallway to see absolutely nothing and no one. It was just dead silence out there. The following day, I had my boss check the cameras in the hallway during the times I was in that room. Turns out, nobody had ever even walked by the door during that point in time, and my boss wasn't even in the building the prior night. Needless to say, I tried to hurry the repairs in that room and leave as quickly as I could. As a few days passed by, my boss asked me to come to his office and talk to me. Figuring it was just another project, I stopped by right before the end of my shift. Once there, he then tells me that he remembered something during the day that gave him the chills. When he had first started working here 10 years prior, they had an older man living in that room as an extended stay. He was always down in the office, talking to the receptionists every morning. But one week, nobody saw him for a few days. Being concerned, my boss went to the room, and that's when they found him. He had passed away in his sleep. Whether it was natural causes or any other cause remains a mystery. Now, anytime I go into a room, I simply state that I mean no harm or disturbance, and I'll be on my way shortly. I've got a ton more stories similar to this. The creepiest thing about the place is that both elevators stop on the 3rd floor only to open to nobody. And in these situations, nobody has pressed the 3rd floor button. I still don't have an answer for that one, even after our elevator maintenance company has been out to work on it over a dozen times. So maybe the problem isn't the elevator. 911, what's your emergency? From Sulfur Eyes. When I was 18, I worked as a 911 county dispatcher for Groveton, Texas, located in Trinity County. There were several small towns within this county, and they were several miles apart from the county jail where I worked a 12-hour shift from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. The county jail is over 100 years old and is located next to a huge courthouse equally as old. Plus, the jail doubled as the sheriff's office. Now, being over the county is not the same as being over the city. When I received emergency calls, I had several different fire departments and police departments responsible for very specific areas. I worked alone, and the only relief I got was that the city of Trinity had its own dispatcher for its own PD. But once the trouble was outside the city limits, everything was mine and my deputy's problem. Now, occasionally, lines get crossed, and emergency calls would end up coming to me rather than the town dispatcher. When this happened, I took the info, remained on the line, and transferred the call and hung up the line once the other dispatcher was active. This particular call was one of those rare crossovers. Now, I saw many things on that job. I had a guy who wrecked his car by hitting a horse in the dead of 2 a.m., another guy who drove off a bridge into swampy muck in an 18-wheeler because he dropped his coffee and tried to reach over and pick it up. And I've even had a man who would call the office because he swore demons were cooking meth in his attic. I've had kidnappings, domestic disputes, car wrecks, and more. I doubled as a jailer and watched over inmates as well. Nothing says fun like spending 12 hours watching inmates sleep. Back to my call. In East Texas, the weather is tropical and unpredictable at the best of times. No, not all of Texas is desert, which is hard for many to believe outside of theater screens. Anyway, we had been blasted by a series of tornadoes and rainstorms within the week. Some roads were flooded and many culverts were underwater, but I hadn't had anything too freaky happening that week, which was a relief. People get into some crazy trouble in small towns and big counties. I had just finished my rounds checking my inmates in the jail and locking up the cell doors with a heavy set of skeleton keys, which looked every bit as old as the jailhouse itself, when my 911 alarms started ringing. They were made to be heard throughout the entire jail in case I was away from my desk. So I rushed downstairs to answer the blaring noise. 911, what's your emergency? A truck has flipped over in front of my house, answered a very frightened woman. She gave me her address, which located her in the city, but when I transferred the call to the city dispatcher, I suddenly heard all kinds of terrified screaming. Chills went up my spine. The screaming was not the woman, but someone nearby her. It was muffled and frantic, clearly all wrong. Ma'am? I heard the other dispatcher. At this point, the connection was complete, and I would normally disconnect from the call. Not sure why I didn't. Oh my God, they're drowning. They can't get out, they're drowning. My heart sank, and immediately I sent every deputy into the city to assist the local PD with the situation. When my deputy arrived on scene, I was advised that this young couple were running around the muddy dirt roads having a little after-dark celebration. One moment they were laughing, and the next they couldn't stop their heavy-duty pickup from losing control. The man who was driving overcorrected, and they flipped the cab over into a deep ditch. Remember what I said about the rain? The ditch was full up with water, and the cab was crushed to the point that the doors were more like vices, trapping the young couple inside. They couldn't open the doors and the water rushed into the cab. Buckled upside down, they were unable to keep their heads above water very long. The screams I had heard in the background of the initial call were the terrified, water-muffled sputters of the couple drowning. The scene was occupied for hours. When they finally cleared the scene, my deputy had returned to the jailhouse, and with dread, I walked up to him. Did they make it out? He looked at me. Yes, but if we were one more moment... He didn't finish his sentence. I understood what he was going to say. Like I said before, normally once calls come in for the town PD, I transfer the call and let them handle the situation. But this time, I'd stayed on the line and sent my officers in first before the dispatch in town could send theirs. If I hadn't, then that one more moment it took to save that couple's lives would have been far, far too late. Even though they lived, I still hear those screams. Chili Beans from Forfears. I work for a coffee giant. No need to give more details than that. These two stories happened a year or so apart and are two different kinds of scary. The first was on my way to work. I was sitting on the passenger side of the car, being driven to work about 6 minutes away from home. It's the same road I've traveled my whole life, and usually it's uneventful. On this route, there's one decently sharp hill going down to the main thoroughfare intersection that has entrances onto an interstate highway going east and west, along with 3 total lights spanning the hill, and the speed limit was set at 45 miles per hour. That day in particular was the beginning of fall, just when things started to change colors, but not chilly enough yet to feel that nice, crisp air. As we passed the second light, sitting at the top of the hill, I saw an almost indescribable sight. A motorcycle tipped over, and what looked to be the remains of someone, but also a large area of red splatter. No first responders had arrived yet, which sank my heart more when I heard in the following days what happened through a local bookstore. A new rider just learning to ride hit the brakes a little too hard, which sent them flying off in front of the bike, and the bike somehow ran directly over their head, crushing it entirely. Sadly, they passed away very shortly after. My heart sank into ice for the rest of the night, and to this day I can still see it when I pause to recall the story. The next crumb of creepy is also, you guessed it, on a closing shift. For this location, during the first couple of years I worked there, we closed at 10:30 or 11 p.m., and so the closing crew got really good at getting everything done at around 8:30, so we could just stand around and chat, tell stories, generally just horse around. On this particular evening, it was an oddly slow Saturday. We hadn't had a customer since about 8:30 or so. It was just me and a shift manager named Annie. The clock ticked to 10 p.m., and we hadn't seen hide nor hair of anyone in almost 2 hours. So we shut off the lights in the front, locked up, and Annie went to count the final till, while I did the small remainder of dishes we had. We both finished in about 10 minutes. We then gathered our jackets and personal things, getting ready to clock out. Out of nowhere, Annie says, "Crap, I gotta use the restroom before we go." I reply, "Sure, knock yourself out, I haven't clocked out yet." Annie rushes to the restrooms, which we had separate stalls each with a sink, toilet, vanity, and a locking door, which we propped open to let the opening crew know no one was in the bathrooms when we closed. The lights were on a motion sensor too. However, even if you swung the doors open, there would be a slight delay before a click and the lights were on. Suddenly I see Annie, who's a pasty and very bright redhead in a teal jacket. She was darting back from the bathroom hallway in a panic. "I think there's someone in the bathroom," she huffed, genuinely scared. I gave her a once-over and told her I checked the stalls a while ago. They'd been clear, and no one had come in the store for hours. Adamantly, she persisted, saying someone was in there, and she added, "I can hear the water running." She then elected me to be the Ghostbuster by getting behind me and pushing me to investigate. We both finally made it to the farthest stall, and I too could hear the sound of water running. My heartbeat is thumping in my ears then. I finally mustered up the courage to open the door. I pushed the door handle down and forced it open, so ideally it would just swing open. To my unfortunate surprise, it does not swing open. Instead, it cracks enough that I can see the light is on, and the faucet is indeed running. This freaks me out. Then I realized what was blocking the door. The tall trash can had been fully wedged under the door handle so it would be jammed shut. At this point, we're both terrified. I rammed the door open the rest of the way against my better judgment, expecting someone hiding in the corner or even bathing in there. But no one is in there. It was just me and Annie. I went quickly to turn off the running water that ran so long the faucet was hot to the touch. I then peeked around to see if there was any further surprises. We both skedaddled right out after that. Come to find out some months later, while sharing ghost stories at our location, the same exact incident had happened to 3 other closing shifts after ours. We just never talked about it before the newest installment of our spooky stories. Haunting at the Funeral Home, from Lady Mortician. I'm a 20-something-year-old female who graduated mortuary school in 2015. Now, I know what you're thinking. And yes, that is a job you have to go to school for. Shortly after graduation, I left my small hometown in central North Carolina for a job opportunity in a major city in Wisconsin. Living in a small town, we only had 2 funeral homes, both family-owned and operated. And unless you're family, it's very difficult to get a foot in the door, so to speak. So not wanting my education to go to waste, I moved halfway across the country to start my apprenticeship as a funeral director and embalmer. Working with the dead never scared me. Up until then, I had never encountered anything spooky or paranormal. In fact, I found embalming to be very clinical, the quietness of the funeral home to be calming and peaceful. This particular funeral home I was working for relied on the apprentices for working after regular business hours, which meant being on call every other night and every other weekend. There were 4 of us, 2 pairs. You always went on calls with your apprentice partner. For privacy reasons, I'll call my partner Peter. It was probably January or February. Earlier that day, we'd gotten a decedent in, a homicide victim. This was not my first homicide case nor my last, but one of the most memorable. The young man was an immigrant who came to the United States to start a better life. He'd worked at a nearby gas station at night while he went to school during the day. We all think we know how we'd react in a scary or violent situation, but you truly never know until you find yourself in one. A lesson this young man learned the hard way. He'd been working the night shift alone when 2 men attempted to rob the store. The only protection the clerk had was a baseball bat, and he'd been overpowered and beaten to death with that bat. To say his body was a mess would be an understatement. The reconstruction would take hours, even with multiple embalmers working together. Once the medical examiner finished their autopsy, the body was released to our funeral home. We were to embalm him, perform the extensive reconstruction work on his head and face, then have his body shipped back to his home country. I recall vividly how I felt walking into the embalming room that day to help the team repair this man's broken body. It's a feeling I'd never experienced before, and never again after. Walking in, I was overcome with this deep, visceral feeling of great sadness. I was almost brought to tears. The atmosphere was so heavy and sad. Peter could tell that something was up, because normally when I go into the embalming room, I'm usually very chipper, playing music on the radio, singing along, talking to the deceased as though they were keeping me company. Even when I went home for the day, I could not shake that somber feeling. That night was to be Peter and I's night on call. Around 2 a.m., the phone was ringing. It was Peter telling me that we'd gotten a death call, which meant we had to go into the funeral home and use one of the company vehicles to remove the body from the place of death. Half asleep, I pulled on my spare pair of clothes I kept sitting out for such events. Working in a big city, it's rare to go through the night with no calls. I slowly made my way to the funeral home. Being a southern girl, I'm not used to driving with 8+ inches of snow on the ground. When I arrived at the funeral home, I was surprised to see that Peter had not arrived yet. I thought for sure he would arrive before me. Luckily, I had a spare key, so I let myself in through the back door of the funeral home. Now, the layout of the funeral home is important to the story, so let me take a moment to explain. We always come in from the back entrance on the main floor. Also on the main floor are the chapels in the front of the building and the embalming room in the back of the building. Our offices are in the basement. The second floor is an abandoned apartment where the original owner had lived while he ran the funeral home. In order to get to the stairs that lead down to the offices, you had to pass the door to the embalming room, a large white industrial door with a lock and keypad entry system. So I turned on a couple of lights and I made my way downstairs to get clocked in and to collect paperwork that I would need to do our removal. I'm sitting at my desk working on the paperwork when I began to hear footsteps up above me in one of the chapels. Knowing that the building is locked up tight, I shrugged it off. It is a very old building after all. I then hear footsteps coming down the stairs from the main floor. So I called out to Peter to let him know I'm in the office. I waited a moment and received no response. So, still thinking nothing of it, I called out again. "Peter? Knock it off, I'm in here. Come help me with the paperwork so we can hurry this up and get back to bed," I called out. Silence. 5 seconds passed, then 10. I started to get an uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach. I was then startled by my phone chiming. It was a text from Peter. "Sorry, roads are bad out my way. I'll be there soon," it read. Reading those words, I felt my blood run cold. I knew what I heard. I knew I'd heard footsteps. Quietly, I collected my paperwork and I peered out the door of my office. I didn't see anything or anyone. My relief was short-lived, however. As I was making my way up the stairs to the main floor to load a stretcher into the van, the lights in the stairwell started to flicker. I noped the heck out of there. I've never loaded the van up so quickly. I waited in the van for Peter to arrive, not wanting to spend another minute alone in the funeral home. Eventually, Peter did arrive. We performed our body removal and made it back to the funeral home. Peter took the deceased into the embalming room, writing up their toe tags, then leaving them on the stretcher to be embalmed in the morning. I told Peter to go ahead and head home. I knew the roads were bad, and I would just have to go downstairs to assign the case to one of the licensed funeral directors and clock us out. As I headed down a few minutes later, Peter called out that he was leaving. I heard the door lock shut behind him. Peter had a bad habit of turning every single light off when he leaves, even when he's not the only one in the building. That night was no exception. Peter never left the lights on to the embalming room, though. Using the flashlight on my phone, I made my way to the stairs and started to walk up to the main level. I was 2 or 3 stairs from the top when I heard it. This absolutely gut-wrenching sobbing. It's the most heartbroken wailing I've ever heard. I stopped cold. That was not the voice of Peter. And besides, I heard him lock up and leave. As quietly as I could, I climbed the remaining steps. Without daring to even breathe, I poked my head out of the stairwell and looked around. The hair on the back of my neck stood up on end. Then I realized that not only is the light on in the embalming room, but that's where the sobbing had been coming from. My heart felt as though it was going to beat right out of my chest. My mind was screaming for me to get the heck out of there, but I was frozen in fear. Just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, I heard a loud banging coming from the other side of the big industrial door. This banging seemed to shock me back to reality, and I hightailed it to the back door. I fumbled with my keys trying to get out, the crying and banging continuing even as I shoved the door open and locked it behind me. I jumped into my car and took a moment to take a few calming breaths, trying to slow my racing heart. Once my heart rate was no longer at heart attack levels, I inserted my key and put the car into reverse. I could not stop myself from yelping when I heard my backup sensor begin to ding. Something, or someone, was behind my vehicle. I looked in my rearview mirror and nearly screamed. In the mirror, I see a black human-shaped mass illuminated by my taillights. I checked my backup camera display, and the shadow figure did not show up on that display. At this point, I was crying. I was too scared to get out of my car to check, too scared to even stay there and wait it out. I took a deep breath and decided to just go for it. I floored it, skidding backwards in the snow, through where the shadow had just been. When I looked up, the shadow was gone. In its place, I saw something I'll never forget. In the snow, there was one set of footprints. The footprints go from where the shadow person was and led to the brick wall, which formed one side of the embalming room. I've never driven away from there so fast. The following day, I called my boss and explained what happened. He's an older man who's been in the industry his whole life. His father owned the funeral home, as did his grandfather before him. He shared that he's had a few experiences of his own. He agreed to let me work out of one of our other locations until the homicide victim was shipped out later that week. My first day back to the main location was apprehensive, scared of what or who may be waiting for me. But when I walked into the embalming room, the air felt lighter, like a weight had been lifted. To this day, I still cannot come up with any explanation other than the young homicide victim was not ready to cross over and just wanted to make his presence known. Many people I've told this story to have not believed me, but I know what happened. There is more to life and death than can rationally be explained. Of that, I'm certain. The Wandering Man, from Anonymous. I work in a large manufacturing facility. There are around 3,000 or so people that work here on different shifts. There is a select group of us that get offered overtime on the weekends, but the majority do not, so the buildings are all empty. One weekend I was working the night shift and didn't have much to do, so I got bored and decided to take a walk around. Man, how I wished I wouldn't have decided to take that walk. I went walking through the other buildings that were relatively dark, with only the occasional motion light coming on here and there. So I'm wandering around getting bored again and decided I'll go to the cafeteria to grab a water from the vending machine. Once I get to the vending machine, it's out of waters, so I decided that I'll go to the cafeteria in the other building. There's a hallway between the two buildings, and for some reason there's not any lights that come on when I'm walking through. So at that point, my only light was coming from the red emergency exit sign. I can see well enough, so I walked on through, and as I'm getting into the other building, I noticed it was pitch black. Here, there were no lights coming on, and I couldn't see anything. I pulled out my phone for the flashlight and decided to keep going through the building. I got about halfway through the building, then my phone died, so now I was just standing in the pitch black with no light. As I'm standing there trying to figure out what to do, I began to hear a voice. I couldn't make out any words, but I could definitely hear someone talking. I thought this was someone on maintenance coming through to look at something. I yelled out into the dark, "Hello?" And I got no response. My voice echoed through the building as if I were on top of a mountain yelling out. Panic began to set in as I realized I'm stuck here. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed a dim red light. I thought I'd caught a glimpse of an exit sign illuminating my way out. I started to try to slowly make my way over to it. Then I hit my shin on something. As I'm standing there holding my hurt leg, I realized that I should be too far into the middle of the building for there to be an exit sign anywhere close. I started to look for the red light again. I couldn't find it. It was like it had disappeared. Frantically, I tried turning my phone back on, but no luck. I began moving very slowly in the direction I thought I last saw the light. As I shuffled my feet, barely moving, I heard a voice again. Except this time, the voice was close enough to hear what it was saying. I stood terrified because I thought the words had said, "This will be your eternity." I panicked and I began to yell out, "Who's there?" But again, I heard nothing. Then I caught a glimpse out of the corner of my eye of the red light again. Except this time, it was in the opposite direction of where it was before. I went ahead and started making my way to that light. Somehow I managed to get back to the dark hallway I'd walked through in the first place. Then I quickly got out of the building and back into my well-lit building. Finally, I was able to calm down. I sat down and thought, what was that other red light I saw? It was a good bit before I ever saw the exit sign light. And who was in there talking to me? The Phantom Traveler, from Harley C. I'm in my early 20s. I'm a CNA in the Pacific Northwest, specifically the Panhandle of Idaho. I'll leave the facility's name out for privacy reasons. This is the story of one of the most terrifying moments of my career, while working with life and death every day. This is why I'll never work in a hospice again. It's the story of when I encountered a phantom traveler. It was the end of 2019 and the start of 2020. I just finished getting my advanced CNA from a local college. It only took me a couple of months and it was quite the fun class. While I was finishing up my studies, my teacher let us know that an agency nearby was hiring. For those of you who don't know, an agency in the medical field is a company that contracts workers to facilities who pay for their service. If you work for an agency, you tend to make more money than if you work at a regular facility. I went online and began looking for jobs, and to my surprise, I found the agency that my teacher had mentioned, and they were hiring at $23 an hour. They were based out of Washington, and living on the border of Idaho and Washington, I thought this was a great opportunity. I could get Washington pay, still living in Idaho, which was a lot cheaper. So I jumped on the opportunity, and about 2 weeks after graduating, I began to work for them. The first place I contracted to was a specialty hospital that was a short-term care facility. The hall I was put on was the ICU hall and the hospice hall. The ICU was the intensive care unit where there was always something to do, and it was constantly busy, while the hospice hall was a little more somber. Hospice was people waiting out their final moments that could range from minutes to months. This hall consisted of people who were conscious and some people who were so ill they couldn't recall what they had for lunch that day. For some reason, I felt compelled to stay in the hospice hall. I can't tell you if that was out of compassion or pity, but to this day I wish I'd never made that choice. Now, I've had some supernatural encounters before as a child, and I'm no means sensitive to that kind of stuff, but I was aware that there was more out there than what you can see in everyday life. After contracting to this specialty hospital, I had a nice-looking resume and decent references from it. So when the time came for my contract to end and to start somewhere else, I was able to get a nice job working a mid-shift from 10 a.m. to 10 p.m. at an assisted living facility. It also had an ICU and hospice hall. I thought I struck gold. The facility was close to me and had the patients I was most familiar with. Little did I know, after working here, I would be pushed away from the profession entirely. When I began working for this company, it was around mid-November of 2021. For those of you who have spent time in the Pacific Northwest, it gets dark here very fast in the winter seasons. Not only was it dark, but I also joined the medical field during the height of COVID. I know, I'm so smart. Around 5 p.m., the sun would start to go down, and it was dark by 8 p.m. on good days. That year, it was a particularly dreary winter. Thick clouds and fog always filled the sky, shutting out the sun at every angle. Due to COVID, the hospitals in our area were always full and patients were being moved around all the time. Even though I only contracted to facilities for a month, I still saw a lot of people come and go in each place I worked. One day, our front desk was notified of a new transfer coming in. They would be staying in the 400 hall. With my luck, that was the hall I was contracted to. When reception notified me of this, I thought to myself, great, another new patient for me to get used to. Working as an agent means I was always moving around and always getting to know new people, which took a long time. By the time I was used to the resident, it was time for me to move on because my contract had expired. I was stationed on the end of the 300 hall and was also responsible for the start to midpoint of the 400 hall. Due to the lack of staff, I had way more patients than anyone should have. Matter of fact, all of us did. That day I was notified of the transfer, I went about my day as usual. Thankfully, this transfer was coming in during the facility's lunchtime, so that meant I could get her room ready while all my residents were eating. For privacy's sake, I'll call the transfer L. Recently, the facility had hired a new NA and assigned her to shadow me so she could take over my hall when my contract was over. I thought this was a great opportunity to give the NA a rundown of how to set up a room for a new resident. Let's call the NA Kate. Kate and I got the room cleaned up and set up her area per usual protocol. Make the bed, clean the floors, sterilize any and all surfaces or contact areas. That's when my radio went off with the front desk saying, "Hey, your new transfer is here." With that, I made my way up to the front desk, introducing myself as I pushed her in her wheelchair down the hall to her room. As I made my way down the hall, I asked her to tell me about herself. She simply stated with a smile, "Oh, hi there, honey. I'm Elle." This was a good sign to me. She was open and eager to talk, which would make my job easier. I introduced myself and said, "Well, hi there, Elle. I'll be taking care of you for a while, and so will my assistant, Kate." I nodded my head in Kate's direction. She gave a nervous smile in Elle's direction. I continued to chat with Elle until we reached the room. She was listed as a Hoyer, so I instructed Kate to go grab one so we could get Elle in bed and let her adjust to her new environment. Kate scurried away to find the machine, and that just left me and Elle alone. To help pass the time and to hopefully get to know my patient better, I asked, "So what brings you over to my neck of the woods? I saw your sheet, but there was no standout reason I saw for you to come here. "Did you just get tired of the other facility staff?" I asked in a joking manner. She simply looked at me and said quite plainly, "Oh, I never stay anywhere for too long. Just so you know, it's Larry who's to blame for me moving around all the time." Needless to say, I was intrigued. "Who's Larry?" I asked, still in a light-hearted tone. Her expression changed to that of something more somber. She lowered her voice and said, "Well, honey, Larry is the ghost who follows me. He's been following me for about 3 years now." My expression went from friendly to slightly concerned. I remembered reading on Elle's chart that she had been listed for possible schizophrenia or early onset dementia. This is what I used to rationalize what she had just told me. After that, Kate burst into the room with the Hoyer, and it broke my concentration on this so-called ghost that was following Elle. I got her into her bed shortly after Kate arrived, then excused myself to go check on my other patients, seeing as lunch was now ending. My day went on as usual, but in the back of my mind I was thinking about Elle's story. That day was an unusually cold one. We got snow for a couple of hours in the morning, only to have it warm up just enough to rain for a little bit, then go right back down to freezing weather. When it rains after it snows, it creates a thick layer of ice everywhere, making it unbearably cold. Lots of our residents called it an early night, and honestly, I couldn't blame them. It was cold in our facility, and while the residents got to crawl into bed under sheets with as many blankets as they needed, I had to walk the dark, cold halls making sure everyone was okay before my shift ended. I finished the nighttime rounds around 9 p.m., about an hour before the night crew would come in to relieve us. Seeing as I was able to finish my charting earlier than expected, I had about 45 minutes to kill until I could leave, and that's if the night crew actually showed up on time. I decided I would just peek into my rooms and see if everyone was asleep, or if someone needed some final bits of help before I left. Having wrestled in high school, I stood up on my sore and beaten knees and groaned a little as I got up. The cold weather wasn't making me feel any better either. I made my way to the end of 300 Hall, and with my luck, that was towards the end of the building. Now, I've walked that hall many times, both day and night, and I've never been creeped out. Sometimes I would get a little unsettled at the sound of a resident moving, which would suddenly break the dead silence of the building. Between my shoes giving off a slight squeak as I walked and the EKG machines, it was just like every other night, until I felt something different. Suddenly, and without warning, I got a bone-chilling feeling, quite literally speaking. I suddenly got so cold, it caused me to get goosebumps, and it made every joint in my body ache. At the same time, I felt as if someone was watching me. I know it's pretty cliché, but that's what it felt like. I was getting more unnerved, which was uncommon for me, and I was to the point of picking up my pace to try and outrun my unseen assailant. I was about to break into a full-on run, but then I jumped when I heard a sound right near my ear. The sound of me stepping in water. Oh God, I thought to myself, assuming that someone had flooded a sink or a toilet. I looked up at the room to see it was Elle's room. I glanced at my watch, seeing it was now 9:45 p.m. I have enough time to clean this, I thought to myself as I slowly opened the door. I glanced around the room, seeing that everything there was normal. As I looked, I checked off everything in my head. Bed, bathroom, windows closed, wheelchairs bedside. I continued looking until something stopped me in my tracks, or rather, someone. Before I could glance over to the machinery, I noticed by her sink, each room in the facility had 2 sinks per room, there was a shadow, one that looked too much like a man. Now, visiting hours were far past finished, and I had no idea how someone would have made it past the front desk and all the way here. I assumed it was a resident who had wandered into the wrong room. Many do have dementia and roam after dark. Seeing as this was an invasion of Elle's privacy, I made my way over to the figure to take him back to his room. As I walked, I noticed my feet were stepping in more and more water. Once I was far enough in the room, I could hear the sink running. It was overflowing and spilling out onto the floor. A little annoyed that someone went out of their way to turn on a sink and flooded in my hall of all places, I started to try to get the man's attention by whispering to him, "Excuse me, sir." His head looked up a little. "You are in the wrong room. I'm going to walk you back to your room and we can lay you back down for the night. Does that sound okay?" I couldn't see his features too well, but I could make out his silhouette. He was a taller man with a bit of a belly and was wearing what seemed to be super tight clothes. The man lowered his head back down and said in a growling-like tone, "I can't go yet. Too much to lose. Too much to take back." This made me confused, to say the least, but I was guessing it was the ramblings of a sick old man. I said, "Okay, buddy, let's just get you up." I went to put my hand on his shoulder to guide him out. As I was doing that, I realized I had never gotten his name. I looked down at him, trying to meet his stooped level. "What's your name, sir?" At this, he looked up at me fully and replied, "Larry." I froze. I could see the man's face better now. He was normal looking, except for the fact that he was soaked from head to toe. His skin was pale and slightly blue. I now recall when he told me his name, it almost sounded like he was speaking with gargling water. Some kind of trance came over me, and I was frozen in place, absolutely terrified. I couldn't move or speak or blink. I stood there for what felt like a few minutes, just watching Larry sit in silence. The longest few minutes of my life. The only sound breaking the eerie silence was of running water hitting the floor and my own heartbeat. Out of the blue, I felt a hand on my shoulder. I whipped around like I had just been comically punched. It was Kate. She was looking at me with a weird expression. The night crew is here, just so you know. I was gonna leave, but I noticed you were not back yet, and you didn't have your walkie." She was right. I had totally forgotten it. I reached down to where it would be and caught a glance of my watch. It read 10:33 p.m. I looked back at her and quietly exclaimed, "I've been here for almost an hour?" Kate looked confused and responded with, "Yeah, the night crew got here late, and I just assumed you had a big mess to clean up or a bed to change. When I came to get you, I heard water running and I saw you at the sink, so I thought you were rinsing something out." I had forgotten about the sink, the water on the floor, the soaked man sitting behind me. I turned back around to see the sink was now off and Larry was nowhere in sight. Matter of fact, all the water I'd walked through was no longer there either. There I stood again, confused and concerned, and a little shocked at the sudden change. Not wanting to be in that room anymore, I thanked Kate for grabbing me and walked with her back to the front desk. Before I left, I closed the door slightly, only to catch a glimpse of a man standing in the corner, dripping wet. Eagerly, I clocked out and drove home in complete silence, completely rattled at what I had just seen. I got home and the thought of showering did not appeal to me. The thought of water at all didn't sound nice. I sat there all night, not sleeping a wink, trying to process what happened. Am I crazy? I thought to myself. To satisfy my curiosity, I began to read up on unexplained encounters over the next few days that other people have had. This led me down the rabbit hole of paranormal stories. From what I can tell, my experience could have been with a poltergeist, a spirit that attaches or follows someone around, usually due to an unjust killing or tragedy. It could also be a demon in disguise, but this one didn't seem to fit the bill. With this information in mind, I decided to look into deaths in the area. What I found made me tear up. I came across an article from 2018 about a wife who had murdered her husband at a lake not too far from me. She embezzled money from his credit union and pushed him overboard after giving him a massive amount of Benadryl. His cause of death? Drowning, and his name? Larry Eisenberg. I have no guilt in sharing this information because it is public, and stories have been written about it. If you want to read it yourself, you can find the stories online from local news sources. As for what Larry was doing following around Elle, I have no idea, and I don't really want to know. I finished out my contract and made sure to never be in that room after dark. I never had any other experiences as vivid or direct as that one, but on occasion people walking the hallway would hear the sound of water dripping and what sounded like moist footsteps. Before I left, Kate swore she saw someone in Elle's room just standing there, then vanishing in the blink of an eye, and I do believe her account. Shortly after my contract ended, I left the line of work and haven't gone back to it, opting to get my degree in nursing earlier than I'd planned. I don't know what happened to Elle, but I see why she was being moved around so much. If this was my first encounter with her and Larry, then I could only imagine what repeat ones would have been like. I've never had another experience like this, and I'm glad. But to this day, the sound of water and the view of the lake Larry was killed in brings me back to that night, back to seeing this phantom traveler. Tales from the Break Room is a viewer-submitted podcast featuring allegedly true scary stories that happened on the way to, on the way from, or at work. If you want your story to be narrated on the show, send it to us at eeriecast.com/submit. As of April 14th, we're paying 3 cents per word for stories that are approved and make it onto the show. Submission does not guarantee approval or payment. For a limited time only, PayPal only. Tales from the Break Room is an EerieCast Network original podcast hosted by Darkness Prevails. You can follow him on Twitter at Dark Prevails, and you can hear thousands more stories read by him on our other show, Unexplained Encounters. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow and rate Tales from the Break Room on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. You can also enjoy plenty more horror-themed podcasts at eeriecast.com.